Hello everyone and welcome back. So this module we're going to be talking about the cardiovascular system. This again is in the anatomy and physiology section of the ATI TEAS 7 exam. So let's get into it. So the cardiovascular system, this is just like the highway of our body. It is transporting things around from all the different organs and systems, just keeping everything running and alive, which is why it is so important. So the cardiovascular system functions to transport material to and from the body's cells. The blood is the major carrier of these materials. It brings nutrients from our digestive system, oxygen from our respiratory system, hormones that are secreted by glands and nerve cells, so such as insulin, immune cells, and products that fight infection. The blood carries that around our body. The materials that the cardiovascular system carries away from the body includes waste products, which will get excreted in the urine, carbon dioxide, which will get exhaled, excess salts, and other materials that are retained by the body. And the circulatory system has three parts. So we have the heart, we have the blood, and we have the blood vessels. There's also the lymphatic system, which is a network of capillaries and veins that carry interstitial fluids and waste through a fluid called lymph. So let's look at blood vessels. So let's look at arteries versus veins. These are things you will see in the body. So arteries, which we can see over here, are thick-walled vessels that carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. Arteries branch into smaller vessels called arterioles and then into even smaller vessels called capillaries. So we have our thick-walled artery, it's carrying the blood away from the heart, and it turns into an arteriole and then into a capillary. If you think about this in the body, the vessels that are near your heart are going to be a lot bigger, right, than the vessels that are down in the tippity top of your fingers. So they start out as this artery, and as they continue peripherally or to other places within the body, they can get smaller and smaller. So veins are thinner-walled vessels that carry deoxygenated blood from the body back to the heart. So we can see the vein here, much thinner wall. The blood first diffuses into the lungs, into tiny capillaries, and then returns to the heart through venules that merge to create a larger vein. So if you think about it, when we talked about the respiratory system, you have those alveoli, and on those you have capillaries, right, where the exchange of the oxygen, carbon dioxide happens between the blood and the alveoli. So that is giving that example. And as blood moves through the system from larger tubules through smaller ones, the rate slows down. So of course, like anything, if you have a lot of water going through a bigger, opening, and then it goes down into a smaller one, the pressure in the smaller opening is going to be much higher and the rate is going to slow down. So that is what happens. So let's talk about blood pressure. So blood pressure is the fluid pressure generated by the cardiac cycle. Arterial blood pressure functions by transporting oxygen-poor blood into the lungs and oxygen-rich blood to the tissues. Arteries branch into smaller arterioles that contract and expand based on signals from the body. And arterioles are where adjustments are made in blood delivery to specific areas based on complex communication from body systems. Capillary beds are diffusion sites for the exchange between blood and interstitial fluid. And a capillary has the tiniest wall of any blood vessel consisting of a single layer of endothelial cells. So we also talked about that in the respiratory system. The capillaries on top of the alveoli have just a thin wall that allows for the oxygen to exchange. Capillaries merge into venules, which in turn merge into a larger diameter tubule called veins. And we can see all of that here. We have our artery goes to arterioles, to the capillaries, to a venule, to a vein. Veins transport blood from body tissue back to the heart, and valves inside the veins facilitate this transport. So again, we can see these valves in the vein. And the walls of the veins are thin and contain smooth muscle and also function as blood volume reserves. All right, so we've talked about different types of blood vessels, so let's talk about the heart. So the heart is a muscular pump that provides necessary pressure to keep blood flowing. The heart has 4 chambers. It has the left atrium right here, the right atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle. And the left ventricle is where blood pressure is the highest, and it has a larger muscle to pump the blood systemically. So the way I remember this, if we look at this picture, we can see the left ventricle, the muscular wall at the bottom is much thicker. And that's because this left ventricle needs a stronger muscle because it's pumping the blood through the entire body. Once the blood leaves this left ventricle, it's going through the aorta and it's getting pumped into the body. Now, there are various valves. So we have the tricuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, the aortic valve, and the mitral valve. And this keeps blood moving in a single direction and prevents any backwash into the chamber. So if you think this left ventricle, it's very strong, right? It's pumping the blood through the entire body. When it contracts and it pumps that blood, if this mitral valve wasn't there, the blood could go up into the left atrium and back into the pulmonary system, and that's not good. So the heart has these valves to make sure that the blood flows in the correct direction that it's supposed to flow. So the heart has its own circulatory system with its own what are called coronary arteries. So we can see this is a picture of the heart, and these arteries are what supplies blood to the heart. And when people have heart attacks, they can get little blood clots in these coronary arteries, and it creates myocardial infarcts, which can make part of the heart die. So these are its own circulatory system. And the complex electrical system in the heart controls the heartbeat as a cardiac muscle cells produce and conduct electrical signals. These muscles are said to be self-exciting, needing no external stimulus. So this is like the pacemaker of the heart. This is what is the electrical system. And so we have our synatrial node, atrioventricle node, left posterior bundle, right bundle, and this is just bundle of His, Purkinje fibers. So again, this is just the electrical signals of the heart. And the way the electrical signals run is it goes from the sinoatrial node down to the atrioventricle node to the bundle of His to the left bundle branch and right bundle branch. So it pretty much just runs like this down the heart. All right, so going back to the heart, where am I going to put me? I'm going to put me here. All right, so the rhythmic contraction and relaxation of the heart is the heart cycle. So we have systole is the contraction of the heart muscles, and diastole is the relaxation of the heart muscles. And you'll see this with blood pressure. So that is what this is talking about when you get into nursing school and you learn about blood pressure and things. The systole is the pressure when the heart's contracting, and diastole is the pressure when it is relaxing. The cardiac output is determined by the heart rate, the volume of blood returning to the heart, which is also called preload, the afterload, which depends on systemic vascular resistance, and vascular resistance depends on the diameter of the blood vessels. So if you think about it, if you eat a bunch of cholesterol and you get plaque on your blood vessels, you're going to have much more vascular resistance because those vessels have now narrowed, and it's a lot harder to have the blood flow through those vessels. And also, cardiac output is determined by mechanical properties of the heart. So we can see here, diastole, the heart is relaxing, so it's filling up with blood. And during systole, it's ejecting that blood, so it's not filling. And this is why when people have certain arrhythmias where the heart may tremble, it's a problem, right? Because if you don't have diastole where the heart fills with blood, then when it pumps, there's nothing to pump. So you need the diastole and the systole to make the whole system work. All right, so let's look at the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycle is the sequence of events that takes place between one heartbeat and the next. The cardiac cycle consists of diastole and systole phases. During the first diastole phase, the blood flows through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And because the heart is relaxed, blood flows passively from the atrium through the open atrial ventricle valve, or the tricuspid valve, to the right ventricle. The sinoatrial, or the SA node, is the cardiac pacemaker located in the wall of the right atrium. It generates electrical signals which are carried by the Purkinje fibers to the rest of the atrium, stimulating it to contract and fill the right ventricle with blood. The impulses from the SA node is transmitted to the ventricle through the atrial ventricle, or AV node, signaling the right ventricle to contract and initiate the first systole phase. The tricuspid valve closes and the pulmonary semilunar valve opens, and blood is pumped out of the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Blood returns from the lungs to fill the left atrium as part of the second diastole phase. And the SA node triggers the mitral valve to open, and blood fills the left ventricle. And during the second systole phase, the mitral valve closes and the aortic semilunar valve opens, and the left ventricle contracts, and the blood is pumped out of the aorta to the rest of the body. There's a lot of information there, but this kind of breaks it down a little bit simpler. I personally like the diagram, but we'll get to that next. So from the body tissue, the blood comes in the vena cava to the right atrium, to the right, through the tricuspid AV valve, to the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve, to the pulmonary arteries, to the lungs. Then it comes back in through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, the AV valve, the left ventricle, the aortic semilunar valve, the aorta, and then back to the body tissue. So if we look over at this picture, this is the way I like to remember it because I have a visual memory, but whichever way works for you guys. So the blood is coming in the superior vena cava to the right atrium. It's going through the tricuspid valve, which is separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. It's then getting pumped through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. So it's coming through here, and we have the lungs connected over here. Once it goes through, gets oxygenated at those alveoli, it comes back through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, through the mitral valve to the left ventricle, and then up through the aorta and into the body. So that is the flow of blood in the cardiac cycle. So electrical conduction. So I know there's a lot going on here, but we're gonna cover it and you will understand. So the SA node, we talked about this as the pacemaker. This generates the electrical signal that causes the upper heart chambers, or the atria, to contract. So the AV node is important for heart function because it directs the cardiac impulse from the atria to the ventricles, and it delays the transmission of the cardiac impulse from the atria to the ventricles. Purkinje fibers allow the heart's conduction system to create a synchronized contraction of the ventricles and are essential for maintaining consistent heart rhythm. So for the ATI-TEAS, you just need to understand that the SA node is the electrical system of the heart, and it is what causes the heart chambers to contract. That's what I would pretty much take away from this. So, but when we look, I thought this was pretty cool. So I wanted to throw this in just to kind of help understand a little bit. So this is a heart rhythm. If you guys have ever seen an EKG, and if you haven't, that's totally fine. When you're in nursing school, you will see them, you will master them, it will be lovely. But this is a EKG rhythm. It's pretty much documenting the electrical activity of the heart, which is what we're talking about. So you have all these different intervals and things going on, but the electrical signal at the AV node, it starts here where the AV node depolarizes, right? So we're depolarizing before the P wave. The P wave is depolarization of the atrial myocardium. So remember that the SA node is generating the electrical signals for the atrium. So it's depolarizing before. So the atrial myocardium, which just means the muscle of the atria, is also depolarizing, right? Because it's not getting any electrical current at all. Then an impulse arrives at the AV node. So now it's letting the heart know you're going to have to beat. You're going to have to contract. The impulse is then passed. So it goes from the SA node to the AV node. So now that heart has that little P wave. And then it's going to the bundle of His. So that's right here. And that's happening right after the P wave. And then it passes to the bundle branches. So it comes down here to the bundle branches. And then it passes to the Purkinje fibers. So that's down here, right? And then you have your heartbeat at the depolarization of the ventricles. So, and you can also think the atrium is up here and the ventricles are down here. So you won't be asked about an EKG rhythm on the ATI TEAS, but it's just kind of interesting to understand that the electrical conduction is what is causing the heart to beat. And that's coming from the pacemaker. So when this doesn't work, when the SA node doesn't work, that's when we are implanting pacemakers in patients to create that electrical current. All right. A lot going on, but you guys are going to be masters after this lecture of the cardiac system. I have so much faith in you. So blood transportation. So blood is transported through the body on 2 systemic loops. So there is the pulmonary loop. This is transporting deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries and carries oxygenated blood back through the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. So we have already talked about this. Blood comes in through the right atrium to the right ventricle, gets pumped through those pulmonary arteries, which then it goes down into the capillaries at the alveoli. And remember, the capillaries are just a single layer so that the oxygen can cross over from the lungs to the blood, and the carbon dioxide can pass from the blood into the alveoli and be excreted through the body. So then after that, the oxygenated blood comes back through the pulmonary veins and into the left atrium to the left ventricle and gets pumped throughout the body. So that loop where it goes from the right ventricle to the lungs and back to the left atrium, that is the pulmonary loop, taking that deoxygenated blood and making it oxygenated. Then there is a systemic loop. So this transports oxygen blood from the left ventricle through the aorta, which branches into the carotid arteries, subclavian arteries, and common iliac arteries, and renal artery. And then blood is returned to the heart through the jugular veins, subclavian veins, and common iliac veins, and renal veins, which empty into the superior and inferior vena cava in the right atrium. In systemic circulation is portal circulation, which is the flow of blood from the digestive system to the liver and then the heart, and the renal circulation, which is the flow of blood between the heart and the kidneys. So all this is saying is that you have the pulmonary, which is going to the lungs, getting that deoxygenated blood oxygenated and bringing it back into the heart. The other type of loop is the systemic loop. So it's going from the heart into the entire body. All those systems were just the entire body, and then back up into the heart. All of these different things. So this portal circulation, we can see that up here. And what happens is you have the portal hepatic artery, which is bringing oxygenated blood that gets pumped from that left ventricle through the body, who comes from there to the liver. And then, the liver does what it needs, takes the oxygen, and then sends the deoxygenated blood back to the heart through the inferior vena cava from the hepatic vein. So then the last is coronary circulation, which we did talk about a little bit previously, but this is when blood enters the coronary arteries, which branch off the aorta and enter the heart with oxygenated blood, and the deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium through the cardiac veins, which empty into the coronary sinus. So we can see these are the coronary circulation down here. We have that coronary sinus, and we have all of these vessels that are providing oxygen for our heart. So those are the different blood transportation systems within the body. So let's talk about components of blood. So blood carries raw materials to cells and removes waste products. It helps stabilize internal pH and hosts various kinds of infection fighters. Plasma is the liquid component of blood and moves blood cells through the body. It constitutes over half of the blood's volume. It contains plasma proteins, ions, glucose, amino acids, hormones, and dissolved gas. Erythrocytes are another word for red blood cells, carry oxygen in the protein hemoglobin from the lungs to the rest of the body and return carbon dioxide to the lungs. Red blood cells form in bone marrow, and white blood cells, or leukocytes, fight infections in the body. They're made up of 5 major types, including lymphocytes, neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. And platelets are fragments of cells that facilitate blood clotting. And we'll be going through a lot of these different cell types later on in other modules. But we can see, so this is a vial of blood. And if you take a vial of blood and you put it in something called a centrifuge, which spins it really, really fast, it separates the different components of the blood. So normal blood is made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and water, proteins, nutrients, and hormones. There is also the lymphatic system. So the main function of the system is to return excess tissue fluid to the bloodstream. It contains transport vessels and lymphoid organs. Lymphoid organs include lymph nodes, spleen, appendix, adenoids, thymus, tonsils, and small patches of tissues in the small intestines. Lymph nodes are located at intervals throughout the lymph vessel system. Each node contains lymphocytes and plasma cells. The spleen filters blood stored of red blood cells and macrophages. And the thymus secretes hormones and is the major site of lymphocyte production. The lymphavascular system consists of lymph capillaries, lymph vessels, and lymph ducts. And the major functions of the lymphavascular system are to return excess fluid to the body, return protein from capillaries, transport fats from digestive tract, and disposal of debris and cellular waste. So if we look over at this picture, these are all the different lymph systems of the body. So you can see they're all over the body of your spleen, thymus, and then all these just different lymph nodes throughout your body. You don't need to have them all memorized, but just to see how that system works and all the different tracks. So then there is also your spleen. So the spleen is in the upper left of the abdomen. You can see it right here. And it's made up of lymphoid tissue. The blood vessels are connected to the spleen by splenic sinus, which are modified capillaries. And the following peritoneal ligaments support the spleen. So the gastrolineal ligament that connects the stomach to the spleen. The lieno-renal ligament connects the kidney to the spleen. The middle section of the phrenocholic ligament connects the left colic flexure to the thoracic diaphragm. And the main functions of the spleen are to filter unwanted material from blood including old red blood cells, and it helps to fight infection. So if we zoom in on this part of the body here, we can see the spleen, the ileum, the splenic veins, and the diaphragm. And that is the end of the cardiovascular system. So make sure to do the worksheet to practice, review the slides, and take the quiz. And then I'll see you in the next module. You guys are doing great. I know it's a lot, but you got this. I'll see you next time. Bye.